Miss Marple did not rush. Rushing would have been undignified and, more importantly, would have altered the scene before her. Instead, she moved with deliberate slowness, her mind cataloguing everything. The precise angle of the door, the quality of light spilling from within, the absolute silence that now emanated from room 52. She had seen death before. Not often, but enough to recognize its particular hush. She stood in the doorway without entering, her eyes adjusting to the dimness within. The room was lit only by the pale glow of street lamps filtering through the window. What she saw in that shadowed interior made her breath catch, though her expression remained placid. A man lay on the floor beside the bed, his body positioned at an angle that suggested violence rather than accident. Even in the uncertain light, the dark stain spreading across his shirt was unmistakable. "Oh dear," Miss Marple whispered to herself, not from shock, but from the weight of knowing that the comfortable predictability of Christmas had been irrevocably fractured. She turned away from the room without crossing its threshold. Important, she noted, to preserve whatever scene lay within, and made her way back downstairs with unhurried steps. Constance was still at the desk, now reading a ledger by the light of a brass lamp. She looked up as Miss Marple descended, and something in the elderly woman's expression must have communicated urgency, for Constance immediately set down her work. "Miss Marple, what's wrong? You've gone quite pale." "My dear, I believe we must telephone the police immediately," Miss Marple said quietly. "There has been an accident in room 52, a rather serious one." The color drained from Constance's face. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "An accident? What do you mean? Should I go up?" "No," Miss Marple said firmly. "I should telephone the police first. We mustn't disturb anything." She paused, allowing her mind to work through the practical considerations. "And perhaps, dear, it would be wise to ensure that no one else goes upstairs, at least not yet." Constance's hands trembled as she reached for the telephone. Her voice, when she spoke to the operator, wavered between English reserve and genuine distress. Within minutes, she had connected with the Millbrook police station. The conversation was brief. Such calls required little explanation. A constable would arrive within the hour, she was told. The inspector would follow. After Constance replaced the receiver, she sank into a chair near the desk. "Who is it, Mr. Ashford?" "I believe so," Miss Marple confirmed, "though I did not enter the room. It seemed best to preserve the scene. But how could this happen? Here, at Christmas?" Constance's voice carried the particular shock of someone whose world had been fundamentally disrupted. A hotel was supposed to be a sanctuary of sorts, a place where rules and civility were maintained. Miss Marple settled herself into a nearby chair with the composed grace of someone preparing for a long conversation. "You will need to wake the other guests, I'm afraid. The police will require statements from everyone who was in the hotel this evening." She paused, her blue eyes reflecting something that might have been sympathy. "Though perhaps it would be better to wait for the constable to arrive. Let them handle the notification. These matters have protocols, you understand." It was during this waiting period, stretching through the small hours toward 1 o'clock in the morning, that Miss Marple's observational faculties began their particular work. Constance paced the lobby, her agitation evident. Upstairs, lights began to appear in windows as guests, sensing something amiss, stirred to consciousness. The Hendersons appeared first, still in their dressing gowns, their faces creased with concern. Behind them came Diana Cartwright, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with alarm. "Constance, what's happening?" Diana demanded. "We heard raised voices. Is everything all right?" "There's been an incident," Miss Marple said gently, before Constance could formulate an answer. "In room 52. The police are on their way. I'm sure it will all be explained shortly." Diana's face underwent a curious transformation, not fear exactly, but something more complex. Relief, perhaps? "No," Miss Marple corrected herself. "Calculation." The woman's eyes flickered toward the stairs, then back to Miss Marple. And in that brief moment, the elderly woman saw a mind working through implications and consequences. "Where's Robert?" Diana asked, her voice strangely steady given the circumstances. I don't know, Constance said. I assumed he was in your room. Didn't he come back from his walk? Diana's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He's not there. I only just woke up, and the bed beside me is cold. He must still be out. And Henderson exchanged a meaningful glance with his wife. They had clearly heard more than they initially let on. The Hendersons, Miss Marple noted, possessed that particular quality of people who had learned through decades of living how to observe without being observed. The blue light of a police car appeared on the street outside, rotating slowly against the dark. Within moments, the first constable was entering the lobby, his uniform crisp despite the hour, his manner professionally alert. Behind him came a second officer, younger and clearly more nervous about the entire situation. It was as the constables climbed the stairs toward room 52 that Miss Marple made an observation she would not speak aloud for several hours yet. Diana Cartwright, despite her protestations of surprise, had not asked a single question about the victim's identity. She had asked only about her husband's whereabouts. The evening had turned into something far more intricate than a simple accident. Inspector Gerald Whitmore arrived at the Thornbury Hotel at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, moving with the weariness of a man who had spent Christmas Eve responding to domestic disturbances and minor thefts. He was a lean figure in his early 60s, with gray hair and the particular fatigue that comes from 3 decades of murder investigations in quiet English towns. His eyes, however, remained sharp, and they took in the lobby scene with the efficiency of long practice. The constables briefed him with the terseness of professional procedure. A body in room 52, identified as one Mr. Edward Ashford, approximately 65 years of age. Death appeared to have resulted from a blunt force trauma to the head. The weapon, likely a heavy candlestick from the bedside table, lay near the body. No signs of forced entry. The door had been locked from the inside when Miss Marple discovered it, or rather, Miss Marple had found it slightly ajar, which itself was a peculiarity worth noting. Inspector Whitmore turned his gaze toward Miss Marple, who sat quietly with her knitting in her lap, her posture suggesting nothing more alarming than a patient woman waiting for morning tea. He had not encountered Miss Marple before, but he had heard stories, whispered conversations among officers about an elderly woman with an uncanny ability to observe what others missed. He approached her with a mixture of professional courtesy and skeptical interest. Miss Marple, I understand you discovered the body? I heard a sound, Miss Marple replied, setting aside her knitting with care. Around 11:30. A sharp sound difficult to characterize precisely. I was in the lobby at the time, and I went upstairs to investigate. I found room 52's door ajar and observed what appeared to be blood beneath it. I did not enter the room. I came back downstairs and asked Miss Webb to telephone the police. The inspector nodded, making mental notes. You didn't see anyone on the stairs? Anyone leaving the room? No one, Miss Marple confirmed, though I should mention that Mr. Robert Cartwright left the hotel approximately 40 minutes before the sound I heard. He went out alone, and Miss Webb mentioned he had been taking evening walks most nights since his arrival. Inspector Whitmore's eyebrow rose slightly. Has he returned? Not to my knowledge, Miss Marple said. His wife, Miss Diana Cartwright, mentioned his absence when she came downstairs. The inspector exchanged a look with his senior constable. Fine, Mr. Cartwright. Check the village, the pub, anywhere he might have gone, and bring him back here for questioning. As the constable departed, Inspector Whitmore turned his attention to the other guests. The Hendersons had retreated to their room but remained awake. Constance Webb sat near the front desk, her hands folded in her lap, her face reflecting the particular shock of violation that comes when violence intrudes upon one's carefully maintained sanctuary. Diana Cartwright had positioned herself on a settee near the fireplace, her posture tense, her eyes tracking every movement in the lobby with an intensity that suggested her mind was working through possibilities at considerable speed. Miss Cartwright, Inspector Whitmore addressed her directly. Your husband, How long has he been leaving the hotel in the evenings? Diana's lips pressed into a thin line before she answered. Since we arrived, 3 days ago. He said he wanted to walk, to clear his head. We've had a rather tense journey. There was a defensive quality to her tone, as though she anticipated accusation. And he gave no explanation for these walks, no indication of where he was going. To the pub, I assumed, Diana said, or simply around the village. My husband is a restless man, Inspector. It's one of his many faults. Miss Marple, observing from her seat, noted the precise calibration of Diana's words. Not angry, precisely, but dismissive, as though Robert Cartwright's restlessness were a character flaw rather than a cause for concern. There was something in that dismissal, a quality of premeditation that suggested Diana had been preparing for this conversation, or something like it, for some time. Inspector Whitmore seemed to reach a similar conclusion, for his eyes narrowed slightly. Mrs. Cartwright, I'll need to ask you some questions about your relationship with Mr. Ashford. Did you know him before coming to this hotel? Diana's face went very still. No, I'd never met him before. And your husband? Did he know Mr. Ashford? Not that I'm aware of, Diana replied. But the hesitation was fractional, barely perceptible to most observers. Miss Marple caught it, however, the way a musician catches a single wrong note in an otherwise perfect symphony. It was at that moment that the front door opened and Robert Cartwright entered, accompanied by a constable. His face was flushed from the cold, his hair windswept, and his expression bore the particular combination of confusion and alarm that came from being accosted by police in the middle of a Christmas night walk. His eyes moved from the constable to Inspector Whitmore to his wife, and finally settling with momentary but noticeable intensity on Miss Marple. In that glance, Miss Marple perceived something significant, not guilt necessarily, but awareness. Robert Cartwright knew something about this night that extended beyond his innocent evening constitutional. Whether that knowledge pertained to the murder itself or merely to circumstances surrounding it remained to be determined, but the evidence of his consciousness was unmistakable to those trained to observe such things. Inspector Whitmore gestured toward one of the hotel's private sitting rooms. Mr. Cartwright, I'd like to speak with you. Alone, if you please. As Robert was led away, his wife's eyes followed him with an expression that Miss Marple found particularly illuminating. Not concern, but calculation. Diana Cartwright was watching to see what her husband would say, and more importantly, Miss Marple sensed, watching to see if he would betray her. The sitting room was small and intimate, furnished with the careful taste of the Victorian era. Heavy velvet curtains, a fireplace with cold ashes, and furniture arranged to encourage conversation rather than interrogation. Inspector Whitmore settled into one chair while Robert Cartwright took another, the constable positioning himself near the door with the discretion of someone trained to be present without intruding. A notebook lay open on the inspector's lap, his pen poised with professional readiness. Mr. Cartwright, Inspector Whitmore began, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man accustomed to extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. You were out of the hotel this, evening, between approximately 11:30 and 1 o'clock. Can you account for your whereabouts during that time? Robert's jaw tightened visibly. He was a handsome man in the way that some men are handsome, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed perpetually preoccupied. His hands, Miss Marple would later learn, bore calluses that suggested physical labor rather than desk work, an inconsistency with his manner of dress and speech. I was walking, Robert said, through the village. I do it most evenings. It helps me think. Think about what precisely? Inspector Whitmore asked, not unkindly, but with the persistence of a detective who has learned that vague answers usually precede important truths. Robert's fingers drummed against the armrest, the same nervous gesture his wife had displayed earlier with her wine glass. Personal matters. My marriage isn't in the best state, Inspector. My wife and I came here hoping Christmas might improve things. Instead, it's only made matters worse. He paused, swallowing hard. I needed air, space. I wasn't thinking about murder. I haven't suggested you were, Inspector Whitmore replied smoothly. Though I am curious why you feel the need to defend yourself on that point. Most innocent men simply answer the question without elaboration. The constable made a note. Robert's face flushed deeper. Did you see anyone during your walk? Anyone who might corroborate your presence in the village? No, it was late, cold. Most of Millbrook was already asleep. Inspector Whitmore set down his pen and leaned back slightly, the posture of a man reassessing his subject. Tell me about Mr. Edward Ashford. What did you know of him? Nothing, Robert said immediately. I'd never met him, didn't even know his name until tonight. Your wife didn't mention him? No. And you didn't notice him in the hotel? A distinguished gentleman, according to Miss Webb. Rather difficult to overlook. Robert hesitated. That crucial moment when a lie assembles itself into plausible form. I may have seen him in the dining room. I don't pay much attention to the other guests. Inspector Whitmore stood abruptly and walked to the window. Peering out at the dark street beyond, the gesture was theatrical enough to be intentional, designed to unsettle. Mr. Cartwright, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Did your wife know Edward Ashford? The question hung in the air like a weapon suspended mid-swing. Robert's face underwent a subtle transformation. Not fear, but something closer to resignation. He looked away, his eyes fixing on a painting of the English countryside that hung above the fireplace. I don't know, he said quietly. That's the honest answer. I don't know what my wife does when I'm not present. It was, Inspector Whitmore would later reflect, perhaps the most honest statement Robert had made during the entire interview. But it raised more questions than it answered. Back in the lobby, Miss Marple continued her knitting with undiminished focus, though her mind was engaged in a far more complex pattern than the simple geometric designs taking shape in her lap. Constance Webb had retreated to the kitchen to prepare tea, and the Hendersons remained in their room, undoubtedly awake despite the hour. Diana Cartwright sat alone on the settee, her posture unchanged, but her eyes now closed, as though she were concentrating intensely on something only she could perceive. It was in this moment of relative stillness that Miss Marple made an observation that would prove pivotal. As Diana sat with her eyes closed, her hand unconsciously moved to her lap, where a small stain was visible on her dressing gown. A stain that, in the electric light of the lobby, appeared distinctly rust-colored. Miss Marple's needles paused for only the briefest moment. The stain could be explained, of course. Menstruation, perhaps, or an accident with red wine or fruit. But there was something about the location of the stain on the inner wrist, where blood would transfer if one's arm had come into contact with a wet surface, that suggested other possibilities. A constable emerged from the sitting-room corridor, his expression suggesting that Robert's interview had concluded without dramatic revelation. The inspector would likely reconvene with the constable, discuss their findings, and begin the slow process of gathering statements from other guests and investigating Ashford's background. But Miss Marple had already begun her own investigation, operating in that quiet way that had served her for so many years. She observed Diana Cartwright's reaction as Robert was escorted back to their room, watched the careful neutrality with which the woman greeted her husband as though their previous exchange had never occurred. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was endlessly fascinating. People rarely murdered for simple reasons. The motives that drove ordinary individuals to extraordinary violence were invariably complex, layered, intertwined with history and resentment and fear. And often, the person standing in the shadows, watching and waiting, was far more dangerous for others than the person who struck the blow. The morning light arrived slowly, grudgingly, the way it always does in late December when winter has fully established its dominion. By 6 o'clock, the Thornbury Hotel had taken on the peculiar quality of a place suspended between normalcy and catastrophe. Inspector Whitmore had established a temporary headquarters in the small office behind the reception desk, where he reviewed preliminary findings with methodical precision. The constables had begun the unglamorous work of interviewing staff, examining the crime scene, and making telephone calls to London requesting background information on Edward Ashford. Miss Marple had not slept. She sat in the lobby still, though Constance had gently insisted she retire. The elderly woman had declined with the explanation that sleep would be impossible anyway, and there was no point in lying awake in a cold room when she could be useful. Constance, grateful for the presence of someone calm and present during such upheaval, had accepted this arrangement with relief. By 7 o'clock, Inspector Whitmore emerged from his temporary office with the expression of a man who had encountered unexpected complications. He approached Miss Marple directly, perhaps recognizing in her composed observation a quality that suggested she might be useful to his investigation. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into the chair opposite her uninvited. "I understand you've been awake all night. That must require considerable fortitude at your age." "One develops the capacity as one gets older," Miss Marple replied without defensiveness. "Urgency becomes a substitute for rest. Besides, I find early mornings in hotels to be remarkably illuminating. People behave differently when they believe themselves to be unobserved." The inspector smiled slightly, acknowledging the observation. "Then perhaps you've noticed something relevant to our investigation." Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. "I've noticed several things, Inspector. Some may prove relevant, others merely the accumulated observations of an idle old woman. But I've learned not to discount my own impressions, however seemingly insignificant they might appear." "I would value your impressions," Whitmore said carefully. "What have you observed?" "First," Miss Marple said, "there is the matter of Mrs. Cartwright's dressing gown. She has a stain on the inner wrist of her left arm, rust-colored, positioned as blood would transfer if one's arm had made contact with a wet surface." The inspector leaned forward slightly, his professional interest evident. "You're suggesting she was present when Ashford was killed?" "I'm suggesting nothing definitively," Miss Marple corrected gently. "I'm merely reporting what I observed. She may have been present, or the stain may have an entirely innocent explanation, but combined with other observations, it becomes part of a pattern." "What other observations?" "Second, there is the matter of Mr. Cartwright's hands. I noticed calluses that suggest his occupation is not what his appearance and manner would indicate. He claims to be some sort of businessman, yet his hands tell a different story. A man who works with his hands, not his mind. A tradesman, perhaps?" "Possibly," Miss Marple acknowledged. "But a tradesman traveling with a wife to a resort hotel during Christmas? Experiencing marital discord significant enough to drive him to nightly walks in winter? It suggests complications beyond simple occupational inconsistency." Inspector Whitmore rose and walked to the window, where pale light was beginning to illuminate the street beyond. "What else?" "Third," Miss Marple continued, "there is the manner in which Mr. Ashford secured his room. He paid in advance, requested a quiet location, and apparently locked his door. A man anticipating an intrusion would do such things. A man expecting a visitor would scarcely take such precautions." "Unless," the inspector suggested, turning back to face her, "he locked the door out of habit rather than fear." "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed, "which suggests a man of some means or position accustomed to security measures. Not a man on holiday relaxing into temporary anonymity." At that moment, a constable entered the lobby from the direction of the dining room, his expression urgent. He approached Inspector Whitmore and whispered something that caused the inspector's jaw to tighten. He nodded, dismissed the constable, and turned back to Miss Marple. "They've found something in Ashford's room. A leather journal hidden beneath the mattress. It contains names and dates and what appears to be financial transactions." "Oh," Miss Marple said quietly. "That explains a great deal." "Does it?" Inspector Whitmore asked, with genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. "What does it explain?" Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion erupted from the upper corridor. Raised voices, distinctly feminine, carried down to the lobby. The constable stationed upstairs appeared at the railing, signaling urgently. Inspector Whitmore moved with sudden purpose toward the stairs, Miss Marple rising with surprising alacrity for a woman of her years. They found the disturbance in the hallway outside the Cartwright's room. Diana Cartwright stood in the doorway, her face flushed with anger, while Robert stood inside, his expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. The constable looked genuinely uncertain about how to proceed. "Inspector," Robert said, his voice strained, "I can explain. The money, Ashford's money, it was supposed to be mine. He owed me, from years ago. I came here to collect it, and when he refused, He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize the implications of his own words. Diana's laugh was brittle, almost hysterical. "You fool!" she hissed at her husband. "You absolute fool! You came here to get money from him, and now you're confessing to murder." Inspector Whitmore's hand rose in a gesture demanding silence. "Mr. Cartwright, I think you should stop speaking without legal representation present. As for the rest of you," he turned to address the gathered parties, "we will need far more thorough interviews. It appears this investigation has become considerably more complex than a simple crime of passion." Miss Marple, standing quietly at the margin of this scene, said nothing, but her blue eyes moved from Robert to Diana, to the constable and back again, observing, cataloguing, beginning to perceive the true shape of the tragedy that had unfolded in Room 52. The interview room had been converted into something resembling a proper interrogation space, with a small table, several chairs, and a constable positioned near the door, notebook ready. Inspector Whitmore had taken Robert Cartwright into custody, pending further investigation, though the inspector remained skeptical of the man's sudden confession. Miss Marple, having been thanked for her observations and gently but firmly excluded from further direct involvement, had returned to her seat in the lobby with her knitting. Yet her mind, like a chess player considering multiple boards simultaneously, continued to work through the implications of what she had witnessed. By mid-morning, Constance brought tea and biscuits to the lobby, and Miss Marple accepted with gratitude. The hotel owner appeared to have aged considerably overnight, the weight of this intrusion upon her carefully maintained sanctuary evident in the lines around her eyes. "The constables are still examining Mr. Ashford's room," Constance said quietly. "They've taken photographs, collected evidence. It's all quite surreal, Miss Marple. I keep expecting to wake up and discover it was merely a dream." "The human mind often seeks refuge in such hopes," Miss Marple replied with gentle sympathy. "Tell me, dear, did you know Mr. Ashford before he arrived at the hotel? Had you encountered him previously?" Constance shook her head firmly. "No, I'm quite certain. He was a stranger to me. Though when the inspector showed me his photograph from that journal they found, something did seem vaguely familiar about him. I couldn't place it, though." This observation interested Miss Marple greatly. "Vaguely familiar in what sense? Did his features remind you of someone?" "Not exactly," Constance mused, her brow furrowing with concentration. "It was more a feeling than a specific recognition, as though I ought to know who he was, but the knowledge was just beyond my reach. Like trying to remember a dream upon waking." Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythmic work, but her eyes had taken on that particular quality of intensity that suggested her faculties were operating at considerable depth. "And the Cartwrights, had they encountered one another before this week, in your estimation?" "I don't believe so," Constance said. "They arrived together as husband and wife, though I must say their marriage seemed remarkably strained from the very first day. Mrs. Cartwright took meals in their room frequently. Mr. Cartwright went out every evening. I assumed it was simply the accumulated tension of a troubled relationship." It was at this moment that Inspector Whitmore emerged from his temporary office, his expression troubled. He carried Ashford's leather journal, which he placed on a side table before settling into a chair with obvious weariness. He gestured to Constance that she might leave, and when they were alone, he turned to Miss Marple with the air of a man consulting an unexpected expert. "I've had the contents of Ashford's journal reviewed," he said without preamble. It contains references to a considerable debt. Not a legal debt, you understand, but rather a personal obligation stemming from a business venture that apparently went badly some years ago. Robert Cartwright's name appears multiple times, along with references to repayment and settlement. How long ago? Miss Marple asked. Approximately 12 years, Whitmore replied. The journal entries suggest Ashford had been attempting to contact Cartwright for some time without success. And then apparently Cartwright recently made contact, suggesting he would be available for a meeting at this location. Miss Marple absorbed this information with evident interest. Did Mr. Cartwright explain why he initiated this contact after so many years of apparent avoidance? He's refusing to say anything until his solicitor arrives, Whitmore said with evident frustration. But his initial statement suggested financial difficulties. Apparently, he lost substantial sums in some sort of investment scheme and decided that recovering money from Ashford might alleviate his situation. How very foolish, Miss Marple observed, to assume that a debt of 12 years' standing would simply be paid upon request. Precisely my assessment, Whitmore agreed. Which brings us to the question of whether Cartwright's confession is genuine or merely panic-speaking. His wife certainly seems to think it's the latter. Mrs. Cartwright is quite shrewd, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. I suspect she knows her husband rather well. If she believes him foolish for confessing prematurely, then she likely knows something about his actual innocence, or at least about the complexity of his guilt. The inspector leaned back, studying Miss Marple with renewed appreciation. You suggest that the facts are more nuanced than they initially appear? I suggest, Miss Marple said carefully, that murder is rarely a simple matter. 12 years of accumulated resentment, the resurfacing of an old obligation, financial desperation, these are certainly motives. But motive alone does not constitute guilt. The question remains, who actually struck the blow? At that precise moment, a constable appeared with an urgent message. The inspector read it, his expression shifting from weariness to sharp alertness. He stood abruptly. What is it? Miss Marple asked. A discovery in the garden behind the hotel, Whitmore said. The constables searching the grounds found something buried in the flower bed near the rear exit. An object that matches the description of a heavy candlestick covered in mud and what appears to be blood. How interesting, Miss Marple murmured. And where precisely was this object discovered? Approximately 15 yards from the rear door, Whitmore replied, near the path that leads toward the village. Miss Marple's knitting ceased. She looked up at the inspector with eyes that suddenly seemed far younger and considerably more penetrating than her age would suggest. Inspector, I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity. What time did the constables discover this object? Approximately 40 minutes ago, Whitmore said. Why? And has anyone observed Mrs. Cartwright's movements during the past hour? Understanding dawned across the inspector's face like sunrise. He moved toward the stairs with sudden purpose, and Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting with deliberate care, rose to follow. The game had shifted. What had appeared to be a simple matter of financial motive and hasty confession had become something far more intricate, a puzzle within a puzzle with layers of deception built upon layers of truth. The Cartwrights' room was empty. The beds remained unmade. Diana's dressing gown lay across a chair, and the window stood slightly ajar despite the bitter cold outside. Inspector Whitmore's jaw tightened as he took in these details. He immediately dispatched constables to search the hotel thoroughly and to alert the village authorities to watch for a woman matching Diana's description. She's run, Whitmore said grimly. But where would she go in the middle of a December morning without coat or luggage? Miss Marple, standing in the doorway of the room, observed the scene with careful attention. Her eyes moved from the window to the dressing gown to a small table where cosmetics and personal effects had been hastily abandoned. She would go where she felt safest, Miss Marple suggested quietly, and she would go with whatever preparation she had managed to make in advance. The inspector turned to her. You believe she planned this, that her presence here was part of some premeditated scheme? I believe Miss Marple said, choosing her words with precision, that very little about the Cartwrights' arrival at this hotel was coincidental. Inspector, might I ask, has anyone investigated Mr. Cartwright's financial situation thoroughly, beyond the obvious explanations of debt and desperation? Whitmore's expression suggested he was beginning to appreciate the elderly woman's capacity for lateral thinking. The constables are working on it. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting nothing definitive, Miss Marple replied. But consider the timeline. Mr. Cartwright arrives with his wife, ostensibly to rescue a failing marriage. He takes nightly walks. Edward Ashford arrives separately, requests a quiet room, keeps to himself, and then, on Christmas Eve, violence erupts. It seems too convenient, doesn't it? Too perfectly timed? A constable appeared in the doorway, breathless from hurried movement. Inspector, we've found Mrs. Cartwright. She's attempting to board a train at Millbrook Station. The station master recognized her from your description and held her pending your arrival. Whitmore's face registered grim satisfaction. He turned to Miss Marple. Will you come with us? I suspect your observations might prove valuable during questioning. The drive to Millbrook Station took 10 minutes through narrow country lanes. The morning had grown colder, and patches of frost lingered on the grass despite the advancing hour. When they arrived, Diana Cartwright was seated in the stationmaster's small office, her face composed into an expression of wounded innocence that fooled no one. She wore a borrowed coat, clearly not her own, and her hair had been hastily pinned. Inspector, she said upon seeing Whitmore enter, I can't explain. I panicked. My husband's arrest, the accusations. I simply needed air, space to think. I wasn't leaving permanently. I was going to London for a few hours, then return. Mrs. Cartwright, Whitmore said, settling into a chair across from her. You were observed leaving your room approximately 40 minutes before we discovered your absence. In that time, a vital piece of evidence was recovered from the grounds behind the hotel. A candlestick matching the murder weapon, hidden in a flower bed near the rear exit. The path from that location leads directly toward the train station. Diana's composure flickered fractionally. I don't know anything about a candlestick. Yet you were running, Whitmore observed, and you took time to change into borrowed clothing before departing. These are not the actions of someone merely seeking temporary respite. Miss Marple, standing quietly near the office door, watched Diana's face with the attention of someone reading a complex text. She saw the moment when Diana's mind shifted from denial to calculation, the precise instant when the woman recognized that the game had moved beyond simple deception. I want a solicitor, Diana said quietly. You shall have one, Whitmore replied. But before we conclude this conversation, I'd like to ask you about Edward Ashford, specifically about your previous acquaintance with him. Diana's eyes widened slightly. A genuine reaction this time, not performed. I don't know what you're talking about. Miss Webb, the hotel owner, mentioned that Ashford's photograph seemed vaguely familiar to her. Whitmore continued. I had the photograph sent to London with instructions to identify him. Edward Ashford, it turns out, was not his real name. His actual identity was Edward Hartley, and 12 years ago, he was involved in a business venture with a man named James Cartwright, your husband's brother. The room fell silent. Diana's face had gone very pale. The venture failed, Whitmore continued, his voice measured and relentless. James Cartwright lost everything. Within 6 months, he took his own life. The inquest determined it was suicide, though some question remained about whether the circumstances were entirely voluntary or whether desperation had driven him beyond reason. He paused, allowing this history to settle into the air between them. Your husband blamed Edward Hartley, as he blamed himself, for your brother-in-law's death. And when Hartley, disguised as Ashford, arrived at this hotel, perhaps seeking one final resolution to an old wound, Robert recognized him. Diana's hands began to tremble. My husband didn't kill him, she whispered. Then who did? Whitmore asked. Miss Marple stepped forward slightly, her voice gentle but inexorable. Mrs. Cartwright, I suspect you have spent the past 12 years watching your husband suffer under the weight of his brother's death and his business partner's survival. I suspect you knew who Ashford truly was long before he arrived at this hotel. And I suspect that when circumstances aligned, when anger and opportunity intersected on Christmas Eve, you saw an opportunity to provide your husband with the justice you believed he deserved. Diana's face crumpled. She looked toward the window where morning light illuminated the railway platform beyond. "James was my friend," she said finally, her voice breaking. "He was kind to me when Robert was difficult, and he died because that man stole from him, cheated him, and then disappeared. When Robert recognized him here, when I realized who he was—" She stopped, unable to continue. "What happened, Mrs. Cartwright?" Whitmore pressed gently. "Robert went to confront him," Diana said. "He came back to our room furious, saying Ashford refused to acknowledge the harm he'd caused, that he felt no remorse. Robert went out for his walk to calm himself. But I couldn't let it end that way. I couldn't let that man walk away again unpunished." Diana's confession unfolded with the inevitability of a theatrical tragedy, each revelation following logically from the last, yet carrying with it the weight of genuine human anguish. Inspector Whitmore listened without interruption, his pen moving steadily across his notebook, while Miss Marple stood motionless near the window, her expression reflecting neither judgment nor surprise. "After Robert left the room," Diana continued, her voice steady now that the decision to speak had been made, "I sat alone and thought about James, about how he used to bring me flowers from his garden, how he would sit with me in the afternoons when Robert was working. He was gentle in a way that Robert could never be, and then one day he was simply gone, and there was no justice, no accountability. Hartley disappeared to some other identity, living his life as though what he had done meant nothing." She paused, her fingers interlacing and separating repeatedly, a physical manifestation of internal conflict. "I went upstairs. I don't know what I intended initially, perhaps merely to confront him, to see his face, to know whether he remembered what he had done. His door was unlocked. I knocked, and he answered, and when he saw me, I think he recognized me. He invited me inside, perhaps thinking I was simply a guest seeking directions or some other innocuous assistance." "What happened then?" Whitmore prompted. "I told him who I was. Told him that I was the wife of Robert Cartwright, that I knew his real identity, that I understood what he had done to my brother-in-law." He became very still, and then he laughed. Diana's voice hardened. "He actually laughed. He said that James Cartwright had been a fool, that anyone fool enough to lose an investment through poor judgment deserved his fate. He said that suicide was merely the natural consequence of weakness." The inspector and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. The sentiment, however callous, painted a portrait of a man whose moral compass had become thoroughly corrupted by years of rationalization and escape. "There was a candlestick on his bedside table," Diana continued. "Brass, quite heavy. And when he turned away from me, dismissing me as though my words and my presence were beneath consideration, something in me simply broke. I picked it up. I struck him, and he fell. And I struck him again. And then I was filled with such horror at what I had done that I could barely breathe." "You wiped your hands on your dressing gown," Miss Marple said quietly. It was not a question. Diana nodded mutely. "I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the candlestick. I wiped my hands on the front of my robe, and then I simply left. I walked down the stairs as calmly as I could manage, though my heart was racing so violently I thought it might burst from my chest. I expected someone to stop me, to accuse me, to drag me back upstairs, but the hallway was empty." "And then you went to bed," Whitmore said, "as though nothing had happened. You lay beside your husband and pretended to sleep while your mind raced through the implications of what you had done?" "Yes," Diana whispered. "And when I woke and heard the commotion, when I learned that he was dead, I felt, God forgive me, I felt relief that it was over. that James had finally received some form of justice, that this man who had destroyed my brother-in-law would no longer walk the earth. Inspector Whitmore set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Cartwright, I must inform you that you have confessed to murder. I will need you to repeat this statement formally with legal representation present for it to hold validity in court. You understand this?" "I understand," Diana said. She looked toward Miss Marple. "Will you tell my husband that I did this? That I acted alone? I don't want him to bear any burden of guilt for something he did not do." Miss Marple stepped forward slightly, her aged face reflecting genuine compassion. "Your husband is already bearing guilt, Mrs. Cartwright. 12 years of it, accumulated like snow on a winter morning. What you have done today, Sui, may provide him with a form of closure, though I suspect it will not absolve him of the guilt he carries for his brother's death. That is something he must work through himself." The drive back to the Thornbury Hotel was conducted in silence, broken only by the engine's steady rhythm and the occasional crackle of the radio connecting Whitmore to his officers. Diana sat between two constables in the rear of the police vehicle, her face turned toward the window, watching the English countryside pass with the detached expression of someone who has surrendered entirely to circumstance. Robert Cartwright was waiting in the lobby when they returned, having been released pending further investigation once it became apparent that his confession was incomplete. His face underwent a rapid succession of expressions as Diana entered: confusion, recognition, dawning horror as he understood what her presence meant. "Diana," he said, moving toward her, but the constables intercepted him gently. "What have you done? What have you told them?" "The truth," Diana replied simply. "That I killed him, that I did it alone, that you are innocent of his death, whatever other sins you may carry." The moment hung suspended between them, husband and wife separated by the consequence of love and rage and 12 years of accumulated grief. Inspector Whitmore signaled the constables to take Diana into the interview room for the formal statement. Robert watched her go with an expression that combined relief and profound sorrow in equal measure. Miss Marple, observing this scene from her position near the fireplace, reflected on the intricate nature of human motivation. Justice, she thought, was rarely simple. It was instead a complex tapestry woven from choices made in anger, consequences unforeseen, and the terrible weight of living with both guilt and innocence simultaneously. The formal statement took 3 hours to complete. Diana Cartwright, with her newly appointed solicitor present, walked through the events of Christmas Eve with methodical precision, answering each question posed by Inspector Whitmore with the calm of someone who had already made peace with the consequences of her actions. By early afternoon, the basic facts of the case had been established sufficiently for preliminary charges to be filed. Diana was taken into custody, while Robert remained at the hotel under the watchful eye of a single constable, free technically but bound by circumstance and emotion to remain present. It was, during this interval, in the late hours of Christmas Day afternoon, that Inspector Whitmore sought Miss Marple out once more. He found her in the hotel's small library, a room she had discovered that morning while exploring the hotel's quieter corners. She sat with a cup of tea growing cold on the table beside her, a book open on her lap, though her eyes were focused on something far more distant than the printed page. "Miss Marple," Whitmore began, "I wanted to thank you for your assistance in this matter. Your observations proved invaluable in directing my investigation toward truth." "Did they?" Miss Marple replied gently, marking her page and setting the book aside. "I wonder, Inspector, whether we have truly discovered the truth or merely the facts. They are not always the same thing, you understand." Whitmore settled into a chair across from her, intrigued by this distinction. "Explain what you mean." "The facts are clear enough," Miss Marple said. "Diana Cartwright killed Edward Hartley, motivated by rage and the desire to avenge her brother-in-law's death. She will be tried, convicted almost certainly, and imprisoned. Justice, as the law defines it, will be served." She paused, lifting her cup and sipping the lukewarm tea with evident indifference to its temperature. But the truth is considerably more complex. The truth involves a man named James Cartwright, who, despite having a wife and brother who loved him, could not bear the weight of his own failure. The truth involves Edward Hartley, whose capacity for empathy had been so thoroughly corroded by years of rationalization that he could laugh at the suicide his actions had precipitated. The truth involves Robert Cartwright, who has spent 12 years carrying guilt for something that was not truly his fault. And the truth involves Diana, who loved so fiercely and grieved so deeply that she became capable of something she would never have thought herself capable of. The inspector absorbed these words with visible discomfort. "You're suggesting that the law's understanding of justice is inadequate?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that justice and truth are rarely aligned. We punish actions, Inspector, not the circumstances that created those actions. We treat crime as though it emerges in isolation, when in reality it grows from a complex soil of human failure and accumulated resentment and desperate love." Whitmore stood and walked to the window where the afternoon light was already beginning to fade. "Do you believe Diana Cartwright deserves to be punished?" "I believe," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that punishment often causes more harm than justice. But I also believe that society requires consequences for actions, that without them, the bonds that hold civilization together would dissolve entirely. So yes, she should face the law, but that does not mean the law has discovered the truth. It has merely imposed an ending on a story that began long before Diana ever stepped into Edward Hartley's room." The inspector turned back to face her, his expression troubled. "What of Robert Cartwright? He initiated contact with Hartley, knowing full well who he was. Does that not implicate him in some fashion?" "That depends," Miss Marple said, "on what his intentions were when he made that contact. Did he intend to confront Hartley and demand recompense? Perhaps. Did he intend to kill him? I rather suspect not. Robert Cartwright is many things. A man burdened by guilt, a man seeking redemption through financial recovery, a man whose marriage has suffered under the weight of his brother's death. But I do not believe he is a murderer." "Yet his wife has taken full responsibility," Whitmore said. "She has freed him from suspicion entirely. Why would she do that if they were in this together?" "Because," Miss Marple replied with evident sadness, "she loves him. Because she believes that he has suffered enough, and that if she could spare him further suffering by accepting full responsibility for this act, then it would be worth the price she must pay. It is a form of love, Inspector, though a tragic one." A knock on the library door interrupted their conversation. A constable entered, his expression apologetic for the intrusion. "Inspector, Mr. Cartwright is asking to speak with you. He says he has something important to tell you about his relationship with Edward Hartley, something he withheld earlier." Whitmore exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, who merely gestured toward the door with an expression that suggested she had anticipated this development. The inspector rose and excused himself, leaving Miss Marple alone once more with her cold tea and her thoughts. She remained in the library for another hour, until the light outside had faded entirely, and the hotel had settled into the particular quietness of evening. Then she rose, gathered her knitting, and made her way downstairs to the lobby. Constance Webb was closing the accounts for the day, her face reflecting the exhaustion of managing a hotel during a murder investigation. She looked up as Miss Marple approached. "I think I shall retire early this evening," Miss Marple said. "It has been a rather eventful Christmas, hasn't it? Though I suspect there are still revelations to come. Human nature, my dear, is rarely satisfied with simple explanations." Constance nodded slowly, though understanding seemed to elude her. "Do you think justice will be served, Miss Marple? For poor Mr. Ashford, I mean. For whoever he truly was?" Miss Marple considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "Justice will be served?" she replied finally, though perhaps not in the manner that poor Edward Hartley deserved. "But then, we rarely receive what we deserve, do we? We receive instead what our circumstances create, what our choices precipitate, and what others decide we are worth." Robert Cartwright's confession when it finally emerged in the early hours of Boxing Day, fundamentally altered the contours of the investigation without changing its essential outcome. He had indeed been in contact with Edward Hartley prior to the Christmas holiday, though the circumstances were far more complicated than his initial statements suggested. He had not come to the hotel seeking financial recompense, as he had claimed, but rather seeking confrontation with the man he held responsible for his brother's death. Inspector Whitmore conducted this second interview with Miss Marple, present at the woman's quiet insistence. She sat in the corner of the small room, her knitting needles moving with metronomic regularity, appearing to pay attention to nothing but the geometric patterns taking shape in her lap. Yet, nothing escaped her observation. Not the tremor in Robert's voice as he spoke, not the careful way he chose his words, not the moments when his eyes betrayed emotions his voice attempted to conceal. "I knew who he was," Robert began, his hands clasped tightly on the table before him. "Not when we first arrived at the hotel, but within hours of seeing him. There's something about a man who has haunted your thoughts for 12 years. You recognize him instantly, even if he's aged, even if he's changed his name and his appearance. I recognized him, and I wanted to kill him." The bluntness of this statement hung in the air like a blade suspended above water. Inspector Whitmore leaned forward slightly. "Yet you didn't kill him." "No," Robert said. "I wanted to. God knows I wanted to. But when I confronted him in his room on Christmas Eve, when I saw him face to face and told him who I was, who my brother had been, something shifted. He didn't deny anything. He didn't apologize or offer excuse. He simply said that James had been weak, that weakness deserved punishment, that the world was populated by failures who couldn't compete and shouldn't expect sympathy." Robert's voice had grown quieter, more controlled, as though by lowering his volume he could contain the rage that had accumulated across 12 years. "I realized in that moment that killing him would achieve nothing. Nothing at all. It wouldn't bring James back. It wouldn't make me feel better. It would merely transfer his guilt to myself, and I would become another victim of his existence. So I left. I went for my walk to clear my head, to decide whether I would report him to the authorities or simply leave the hotel and try to move forward with my life." "And your wife?" Whitmore asked. "What did you tell her when you returned to your room?" Robert's expression shifted into something approaching anguish. "I told her everything. I told her who Hartley was, what he had done, how I felt. I should have realized that she would take it upon herself to act where I had decided not to. But Diana has always loved with an intensity that frightens me sometimes. She loved James deeply. She loved me despite my failures, and she could not accept that this man would simply walk away unpunished." "Did you suspect that she intended to confront him?" Whitmore pressed. "Not until it was too late," Robert replied. "I thought she was simply processing the information, that she would need time to adjust to the knowledge of Hartley's presence. I didn't understand that her mind was already moving toward action." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly, a pause so subtle that only someone observing intently would have noticed. Robert's words, she reflected, contained a particular quality of self-deception that was common to people who loved desperately and feared their own capacity for destruction. He had told himself that he suspected nothing, but the truth was more nuanced. He had suspected, perhaps even hoped, that Diana would do what he could not bring himself to do. The distinction between action and complicity had become, in his mind, a means of absolving himself of responsibility. "Mr. Cartwright," Inspector Whitmore said carefully, "are you suggesting that your wife acted without your knowledge or encouragement?" "Yes," Robert said immediately. "I would never have asked her to. I would never have suggested—" He stopped, his hands unclenching and reclenching. But perhaps I should have been more careful about what I said. Perhaps I should have hidden my feelings better. Diana reads me too well. She knows me too completely, and she loves too fiercely to allow the man she loves to suffer." The inspector exchanged a look with Miss Marple, who had resumed her knitting without comment. What Robert was describing was not innocence, but complicity of a particular sort. The complicity of a man who had unleashed emotions he could not control, who had shared his rage. with a woman desperate to relieve his suffering, and who now found himself reaping the consequences of that sharing. "Your wife has taken full responsibility for the murder," Whitmore said. "She insists that you are innocent, that you neither encouraged nor assisted her in this act. If you were to testify to a different version of events, if you were to suggest that you had indeed encouraged her, that this was a joint action, it might mitigate her sentence considerably. She would be seen as acting under influence rather than as a sole perpetrator." Robert's face underwent a complex transformation. "No," he said finally, "I won't do that. Diana acted according to her own conscience, her own moral code. If I were to suggest otherwise, I would be betraying her in the most fundamental way possible. She's given me a gift by accepting full responsibility. The gift of freedom, of continuation, of life without the weight of murder on my conscience. I won't repay that gift by destroying her." Miss Marple set down her knitting and folded her hands in her lap. In that moment, she perceived the true tragedy of the situation. Not the death of Edward Hartley, which perhaps deserved to happen, but the death of a marriage that would inevitably follow. Diana Cartwright, in her fierce desire to save her husband from suffering, had ensured that he would spend the rest of his life carrying the burden of a sacrifice. The trial concluded on a grey afternoon in February, 3 months after Christmas had been irrevocably altered by violence and revelation. Diana Cartwright was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, a distinction that reflected the jury's apparent sympathy for her motivations, even as they acknowledged the indefensibility of her actions. She received a sentence of 8 years' imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 5, a judgment that seemed to satisfy no one entirely. Neither those who believed she deserved harsher punishment, nor those who felt she deserved none at all. Miss Marple attended the final day of the trial, sitting quietly in the gallery with her knitting, observing not the proceedings but the faces of those affected by them. Robert Cartwright sat in the public seating, his expression a study in controlled anguish. Constance Webb was present as well, her hotel having become unwillingly famous as the site of a celebrated murder case. The Hendersons had departed Millbrook weeks earlier, returning to their quiet retirement in Surrey, though not before expressing to Miss Marple their conviction that justice had been thoroughly muddled by sentiment and circumstance. After the verdict was read and the court dispersed, Miss Marple made her way to the solicitor's office, where Robert had agreed to meet her. He appeared diminished somehow, as though the trial had extracted something essential from his being that could not be easily recovered. His hair had grayed noticeably in the weeks since Christmas, and his hands bore the particular tremor of a man existing in a state of permanent anxiety. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with evident surprise, "I didn't expect, that is, I wasn't certain you would wish to see me after everything." "I wished to see you," Miss Marple replied simply, "because I believe there are still matters that require discussion, matters of consequence to your understanding of what has transpired." They settled into chairs in the solicitor's waiting room, a space rendered anonymous by its very blandness. Miss Marple arranged her knitting with care before addressing Robert directly. "I wonder if you have considered," she began, "the full implications of what occurred on Christmas Eve. Not merely the events themselves, but what they reveal about human nature and the choices we make when confronted with circumstances we cannot control." Robert looked at her with confusion mingled with resignation. "I'm not certain I understand what you mean, Miss Marple." "I mean," Miss Marple said gently, "that you have been operating under a misapprehension regarding your wife's actions. You believe that Diana acted independently, motivated by her own moral outrage and her desire to avenge your brother's death. But I suspect the truth is considerably more complex than that." "What do you mean?" Robert's voice had become very quiet. "I mean," Miss Marple continued, "that Diana did not simply overhear your conversation with Edward Hartley and decide independently to act. I mean that you, perhaps unconsciously, communicated to her not merely the facts of what Hartley had done, but also your own continued desire for retribution. You told her that you had wanted to kill him, that killing him would have been justified, and in doing so, You created an environment in which Diana felt compelled to complete what you could not. Robert attempted to speak, but Miss Marple raised a hand gently. I'm not suggesting that you deliberately encouraged her to murder, but I'm suggesting that you communicated to her, through tone and word choice and the depth of your rage, that this act would be a service to you and to James's memory, and Diana, loving you as she does, interpreted that communication as permission, or perhaps even as a request. The color had drained from Robert's face. You can't believe that? You can't suggest that I somehow caused Diana to— I suggest nothing. Miss Marple interrupted quietly. I merely observe. And what I observe is that you have constructed a narrative in which you are innocent and Sienna is wholly responsible. It is a comforting narrative, but it is not an entirely truthful one. The truth is that you are both responsible. You for creating the conditions in which violence became conceivable, she for executing that violence. You are both guilty, though the law has chosen to punish only her. Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping backward. I don't need this. I don't need to hear this. No, Miss Marple agreed calmly. You don't need to hear it. But you need to understand it, because understanding is the only path toward genuine redemption. Diana has accepted responsibility for her actions. She sits in a prison cell and bears the consequences of choices she made. But you, Mr. Cartwright, must bear the consequences of choices you made that led to her imprisonment. That is a far heavier burden in many ways, because it is a burden that will never be alleviated by the passage of time or the remission of your sentence. She gathered her knitting with deliberate slowness. I suspect that in the years to come, you will have considerable opportunity to contemplate what you have set in motion. I suspect you will visit your wife in prison, and you will see in her eyes the knowledge that she sacrificed herself for you. And you will either spend the remainder of your life attempting to honor that sacrifice through genuine moral reformation, or you will spend it running from the knowledge of what your rage precipitated. Miss Marple rose to her feet, moving with the careful grace of advanced age. The choice, Mr. Cartwright, is yours. But make no mistake, you have a choice to make. You are not merely a victim of circumstance. You are an architect of tragedy. She left him standing in that anonymous office, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Outside, the February afternoon had grown darker, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the station, her knitting bag held securely against her side, her mind already turning away from the Cartwright case toward the complex tapestry of human nature that had been revealed through it. Back in Millbrook, Constance Webb had begun the slow work of restoring her hotel to its previous anonymity. The room where Edward Hartley had died had been thoroughly cleaned and redecorated, though guests would likely continue to request different accommodations for years to come. The village had returned to its normal rhythms, though the shadow of the crime lingered in conversations and memory. And in her cell, Diana Cartwright sat quietly, accepting her punishment not as injustice, but as the price of love. Fierce, desperate, ultimately destructive love. She had saved her husband from the burden of murder, she believed, even as she failed to understand that she had merely transferred that burden to him in a different form. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected as her train pulled away from Millbrook Station, was a mystery far deeper than any crime. The motives that drove people to extraordinary actions were rarely simple or comprehensible to those outside the situation. Understanding required not judgment but empathy, not condemnation but acknowledgement of the terrible circumstances that sometimes forced ordinary people toward extraordinary choices. The case of the locked room on Christmas night would remain in police files as a straightforward murder case, solved through investigation and confession. But Miss Marple knew the truth was far more intricate. A tapestry woven from guilt and love and 12 years of accumulated grief. A tragedy not of individual wickedness, but of human frailty confronting circumstances too complex to navigate successfully. And that, she understood, was the truest mystery of all, not why people committed crimes, but why, Given the circumstances they faced, they didn't commit more of them.